Now the rest of the news. Israel has completed her withdrawal from Sinai after almost 15 years of occupation.
In Argentina, the government hasn't yet declared war, but the people have.
Another 900 British paratroops on their way. Good evening. The day after the recapture of South Georgia, Mrs. Thatcher has been talking about what happens next. She says Britain still wants to negotiate a peaceful solution, but time is getting extremely short. And she has fueled speculation that more military action is about to be taken by saying, "We will have a greater chance of getting a peaceful settlement if we bring greater military pressure to bear on the Argentine government." But she wouldn't be drawn into saying what that military pressure was likely to be. President Reagan, too, has said time is running out. And it's in Washington that the diplomatic efforts are concentrated. Argentina's foreign minister, though he's called off a meeting he was to have held with Mr. Hague, is believed to be preparing for a private talk with him. In London, the Ministry of Defence has given more details about the British assault yesterday on South Georgia. The Argentine commander didn't formally surrender the island until 10 o'clock this morning. By then, Leith had been recaptured, as well as Grytviken, which was taken yesterday. Over 150 Argentine servicemen, including those on the submarine Santa Fe, have been taken prisoner, and almost 40 civilians. They will all be sent back to Argentina. Here's our defence correspondent, Christopher Wayne.
The official version was vague. We weren't told the number of warships involved, the types of helicopters, or the weapons used, or the size of the force landed. All of those details would of course be useful to Argentine intelligence staff. All the same, the story was exciting enough. At first light in South Georgia, 2 Royal Navy helicopters were heading back out to sea, having dropped off a couple of fighting patrols. As they flew out, they were fired at by Argentine troops, but 5 miles offshore they spotted the submarine Santa Fe, on the surface, heading towards Grytviken. A message was flashed to the warships, and other helicopters were launched to attack the submarine.
At the time of the attacks, the submarine was heading into harbour, and 3 direct hits were scored on the submarine. It managed to struggle into port, but missed the jetty and beached on a beach where smoke and oil were seen to be pouring from her conning tower.
It wasn't all that poured out, because the British had had a remarkable stroke of luck. Santa Fe was ferrying in another 40-odd troops to reinforce the Grytviken garrison, including a senior officer who'd arrived to take over. So when the British observation patrols realized that these thoroughly demoralized survivors were more soldiers, they radioed the ships. The landing was brought forward. While the warships shelled the Argentine observation posts and the landing zone, Royal Marine commandos and soldiers were flown in to attack Grytviken.
They moved against the Argentinian garrison at Grytviken and were able fairly quickly to move up to a position where they could establish some superiority over the enemy. At this time, at Grytviken garrison, the Argentinian flag was flying, but opposition appeared limited, if not unenthusiastic. The force commander ashore moved in resolutely, and eventually a white flag was hoisted alongside the Argentinian one. This was at approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon. 45 minutes later, as our own troops advanced, the Argentinian flag was lowered and the garrison at Grytviken were assessed to have surrendered. For information, last night the Argentinian submarine commander and the garrison commander were entertained to dinner on board one of Her Majesty's ships, and they recorded to the captain great gratitude for the humanity being shown to all the prisoners.
But the fighting wasn't over yet. While the captors were settling down to dinner, the ships were moving northwest to the harbour of Leith. 38 Argentine civilians, the scrap metal dealers who'd started the whole crisis, had said they wanted to surrender. But 16 Argentine Special Forces soldiers, the Buzos Tácticos, had said they intended to fight. So, during the night, British forces landed, almost certainly men of the Special Boat Squadron, who are the Marines' equivalent of the Army's SAS. At first light, the lone Argentine section was surrounded, and this morning they surrendered without any further fighting. So South Georgia was repossessed for the United Kingdom without any loss of life. It was a remarkable achievement, but it was also because the landing party were under rigid instructions to try to avoid bloodshed.
We are not in the business of killing people. We are desperately trying to avoid bloodshed of all kinds, and as I said before, this operation was very carefully planned, and luckily the planning has paid off.
For the Argentine military staff, the loss of South Georgia is one of those things that couldn't be avoided, but they will be impressed by the efficient way the Royal Navy mounted this operation within 3 weeks from halfway across the world. And they must now be seriously concerned about what will happen in the Falklands. They'll also be having to consider the possibility of early moves by the SBS. The Special Boat Squadron is an elite unit which just happens to have specialised in seaborne operations behind enemy lines in Arctic winter conditions. Like the SAS, they're highly trained in everything from photography to signalling, and they're all qualified parachutists. Apart from swimming ashore from submarines, they also use inflatable assault boats. But the preferred way of reaching their targets is by air. All SBS men are trained parachutists, and they can also abseil 200 or 300 feet from helicopters. Sometimes they use the more traditional kind of landing craft, but these are regarded as slow and vulnerable to fire from shore batteries. They're also unstable, and in the bad weather prevailing, landing craft were probably ruled out. The mountainous terrain around Grytviken is shown in these scenes from an exercise in South Georgia. And here's Grytviken itself, a small deserted whaling station offering almost the only protection in an inhospitable island. But this bay is about to become the jumping-off point for the Falklands invasion. When does that come? Well, it's anyone's guess. If the secret were to leak out, it could cost lives. Defence Ministry planners are disturbed that Argentina was given so much advance warning of the seizure of South Georgia. As one senior officer put it, they could have been waiting for us, and they very nearly were.
The attack on the island of South Georgia provoked anti-British demonstrations in the Argentine capital. The military junta eventually admitted the loss of Leith Harbour and Grytviken, but maintained that Argentine forces were continuing to fight the invaders from bases inland. Our correspondent Michael Burke reports from Buenos Aires on the people's reaction to the British invasion.
This was spontaneous anger, a demonstration that began as news of the British attack spread, not the choreographed mass politics normally practiced in Argentina. What she's screaming is, why kill one Englishman when you can kill 3? The anger was real. It was barely contained by the police, hurriedly moved in to control the crowd and the circling traffic. They knew only that the British and Argentines were fighting, not that the British had already won. The officially controlled radio and television rationed news. First there'd been an attack, later it had been beaten off, much later still it had started again and met valiant resistance. All the time the British were labelled aggressors. The demonstration continued long after night fell. By then they still had not been told South Georgia had fallen. As far as they were concerned, the battle was still going on. Those in Government House knew better. The lights burned late as the junta worked out what to do next.
Long after the British said the battle was over, the government here were claiming their troops were still fighting, with, as a communique put it, unbreakable spirit. If the British strategy is to increase the pressure on Argentina so high that their will cracks, then there's no sign yet of it working. Now that they're being shot at, the response here is to shoot back.
At the biggest naval base on the mainland, Puerto Belgrano, Argentina's elite force of Marines were preparing to reinforce the garrison on the Falklands. These men were the spearhead of the original invasion.
Compañía de frente!
Now they're getting ready to go back to meet a British attack on the larger Falkland Islands they believe is only 48 hours away.
Back in Buenos Aires, British citizens began arriving at the embassy for advice about whether or not to leave.
I got interest there now. I got an estancia outside. I don't want to just abandon that.
But are you considering leaving?
No.
My mother's 84. She's ill in bed. She's an invalid. So what do I do? Where do I go?
Well, everybody's worried. We're all worried.
Are you considering leaving?
Well, I've come here to fix up my papers in case I have to leave.
That must be a bit of a wrench for you, though, is it?
Well, it is. I've been here 50 years already. So I've been here longer than I was in England.
The details of the military operation in South Georgia were given first to MPs this afternoon by the Prime Minister, and in her statement she reaffirmed her determination to continue seeking a negotiated settlement. But she emphasised time is running out as the British task force sails on. Here's our political editor, John Cole.
Westminster isn't in a triumphant mood despite the victory in South Georgia. There's quiet satisfaction over that victory, but a recognition that by far the most difficult military or political tasks lie ahead. And conversation in the lobby among MPs shows that the national debate over the Falklands is just beginning to open up. In the House, Tony Benn warned Mrs Thatcher that the majority in Britain wouldn't follow her into war. And as Mr Foote made clear, Labour's shadow cabinet this morning had decided to keep at a discreet distance from the Prime Minister.
We on this side of the House remain as firmly, unshakably, persistently committed to fresh initiatives in search of a peaceful settlement, and if one initiative fails, then another has to be started. And in the meantime, yes indeed, that's the spirit in which the government should be going about their business.
Mrs Thatcher repeatedly said she wanted to negotiate it, but she insisted the Argentines must obey the United Nations resolution, and she tried to impress them with the urgency she feels.
I must point out to the House that time is getting extremely short as the task force approaches the islands. It has in fact been 3 weeks since that resolution. And of course one cannot just have a wide range of choice, wide range of military options with a task force in the wild and stormy weathers in that area.
Tory backbenchers are divided on how to interpret that urgency. A certain amount of double bluff is suspected. Most agree with the Prime Minister that negotiations are more likely to succeed if military pressure is increased. And many think that means the War Cabinet is reconciled to some action on the Falklands themselves, possibly a reconnaissance by the Special Boat Squadron and possibly in the West Falklands as preliminary to an invasion. On this thesis, Francis Pym, on whom Conservative doves had relied to keep the Prime Minister's more bellicose instincts in check, is now far from sanguine about the diplomatic possibilities. But a well-placed Whitehall source said the government had to keep everyone guessing, and a minister argued privately that military victory in South Georgia would allow Mrs Thatcher to be more magnanimous if the Argentines would just come back to the negotiations. The government's almost certain to concede the debate that Labour's asking for on Thursday, and Mr Pym's certain to be pressed then from both sides to reveal more of the negotiating options. The Prime Minister went somewhat further in a panorama interview this evening on those options. She seemed not to be ruling out the possibility of UN or US elements in an interim administration, but she emphasised that her first priority remains unchanged to get Argentina to withdraw its forces.
Of course we will try to go on getting a peaceful settlement. No one wants it more than I do. It seems to me absurd that Argentina doesn't withdraw her young men from those islands under the United Nations resolution. If she did, and we could get, say, the United States to guarantee the security of the islands, or even perhaps the United Nations force, then we could withdraw our task force, and then there would be hope of solving it all peacefully. That's my objective, and what I shall work for.
Most of the diplomatic efforts to find a peaceful way out of the crisis are centred in the United States. The American Secretary of State, Mr Haig, is still trying to find a formula that will satisfy both Britain and Argentina. The Argentines are themselves trying to bring pressure on Britain through the Organisation of American States. Foreign ministers of the OAS have been meeting in Washington since late afternoon, trying to decide whether to take action against Britain. Martin Bell reports.
This was a meeting called by Argentina and a meeting mainly of Argentina's friends, the Spanish-speaking countries of Central and South America. By a two-thirds vote, they could agree on some kind of collective action against Britain. Trade sanctions, perhaps?
Oh, no. Just words. We were American solidarity, and we come with this.
Thank you. The states least likely to show solidarity are the English-speaking countries of the Caribbean, island nations like St. Lucia and Barbados, members of the OAS but not signatories of the treaty. Only one of them, Trinidad, has a vote, and Trinidad is treading warily.
I regard myself as one here to look at the facts of the situation and to work for the maintenance of peace.
Two of the main negotiators are here, but only to work up support for their positions, not to talk to each other. Mr. Haig is hoping to resume his mission, but Mr. Costa Mendes had earlier declined to meet him as a protest against the British action in South Georgia. Instead, Argentina is turning to its friends in the OAS, in a meeting the Americans tried to block, and will put its full case later tonight. All that's been agreed so far is a resolution calling for peace, and the country which breached the peace 3 weeks ago was happy to speak up for that.
Peace shall be the guideline, and that law shall prevail.
The Americans are more than ever in a difficult position, under pressure from the countries of South America to lean on the British, and under pressure from congressional and public opinion to take Britain's side. Mr. Reagan, appearing today at a speech only a block away from the OAS meeting, made it clear that the even-handedness would continue.
While the situation is increasingly difficult and time is surely running out, we remain determined to do all we can to help Britain and Argentina resolve their differences without further conflict. Working for peace is both a moral duty and a practical necessity. We should have no illusions. This task is immensely difficult, and we can no more solve the world's problems than we can isolate ourselves from them.
So the Americans are persisting with their peace effort, even though it seems close to collapse, and the loss of South Georgia, so far from driving the Argentines to the conference table, seems to be keeping them away from it.
Well, that's what's worrying Whitehall tonight. Will the slap on the wrist bring the Argentines to the conference table, or will it have quite the opposite effect? Having shown her willingness to use military force, Mrs. Thatcher now faces 48 hours or so of anxious waiting. According to the Foreign Office, the whole strategy is still on course. Round 1 was diplomatic pressure, which Britain won. Round 2 was economic pressure, which again went Whitehall's way. Round 3 was the use of military might, and unless that persuades the Argentines to give ground, it will have failed. There'll now be a lull while the Argentines decide what to do next. Whitehall is encouraged by the fact that yesterday's military action does not seem to have produced much of a backlash at the OAS in Washington. And after yesterday's refusal to meet Secretary of State Haig, Mr. Costa Mendes has been remaining silent today, presumably awaiting orders from his military masters back home. But if those orders are to terminate negotiations, if Mr. Haig does find himself up against a brick wall, Mrs. Thatcher's only alternative is to step up the military action. Whitehall has no doubt Mrs. Thatcher will not flinch from that course, but it's realised that South Georgia was a relatively easy target. If this conflict escalates, it will not always be so. Another 900 paratroops have left to join the task force. They sailed from Portsmouth in the converted North Sea ferry Norland, and the force has also been strengthened by 36 Royal Marines who all know the Falklands well. They were in the garrison which fought the Argentines in Port Stanley before surrendering. Jeremy Hand saw them arrive on the Canberra.
They'd all asked to go back to the Falklands, and as quickly as they could be turned round, they were going back. The 36 Royal Marines were flown to join the Canberra to be back with their colleagues and to have the chance, if the chance arises, to be the first ashore and reclaim what was taken from them. In new kit and with new weapons, they joined the rest of the Marines in high spirits. And with the newcomers, a very special memento from Port Stanley. This flag used to fly over the governor's residence and was taken down long before the Argentines arrived. These men have just one aim, to put it back where it came from. How important is it to you personally that the Marines go back and get back what was taken from them?
Well, it's very important. I think it's important for any bloke who's in the forces. If he suffers a defeat, the first thing he wants to do is get back and show him, you know, that it wasn't his fault that they were defeated.
Can I finally ask you, I mean, what reason particularly makes you want to come back?
Well, when we actually got sent back to the airport, as we were driving past, we were sent back to the APC, back to the airport, and you could see the civilians looking through the windows. They looked so worried, and you felt if though you'd let them down in some way. But like I say, that's the reason why I wanted to go back, and I think that's what the reason why most of the folks want to go back.
Now the 36 Marines will slip back into their units and pick up their training with the 2,000 other men on board. And their first-hand knowledge of Argentine soldiers is already proving invaluable.
900 men of the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment were led cheekily out of their Aldershot barracks this morning with highly pointed musical reference. But for the Falklands conflict, the paratroopers would now have been on their way to Belize, and 6 months ago they were taking part in manoeuvres in Norway and Kenya. During a 2-year tour of duty in Northern Ireland, 18 of their number were massacred at Warren Point. Then the by now familiar sight at Portsmouth Dockyard. Another ship leaves port to join the task force. The familiar expressions of emotion too, tears and waves for husbands, sons and fathers.
There's a growing belief that Argentina's real motives for occupying the Falklands may lie further south in Antarctica. It's said that control of the Falklands means control of Antarctica's mineral wealth and the sea lanes round Cape Horn. Michael Vesti now reports from Antarctica on the continent's value and the harsh conditions faced there.
Antarctica, the frozen continent where few live and even fewer visit. The icebergs loom out of the mist, signs of a sea that's freezing over, and the first indication that ahead lies the Chilean base called Lieutenant Rodolfo Marsh on King George's Island. The ice-covered airstrip separates the Chilean base from the Russian outpost, both built on jagged, snow-capped rock. It seems at first impossible that people can live here. For the Chilean scientists who man this base, a tour of duty lasts a year. For the neighboring Russians, it's 3 months at a time. Perhaps that's why the Chilean camp commander, Fernando Gile, embraces me when I arrive.
Nice to see you.
The lonely winter months have begun. Visitors must break the monotony. And yet there is plenty of work for them to do in their insulated metal huts. It's odd to think that British weather reports can include information given by the men at this base and others operated by many nations in Antarctica. Chile and the Soviet Union do not worry about each other here. There is daily contact between the two bases. To get to the Russian camp, you cross a narrow frozen river known here as the Volga, marked by boats that soon won't be able to sail when the ice takes over. And there are Russian signposts to remind the men of home. Moscow, it says, pointing hopefully across the bay, 15,200 kilometers. The Russian base commander, Dr. Oleg Struing, greets me warmly. He won't talk about the Falkland crisis. Today, he says, his men are more preoccupied with studying the Russian football results telexed to them from Moscow. Britain has 6 bases here. One of them was in the Falklands in South Georgia, considered to be the gateway to Antarctica. Control South Georgia and you hold considerable power over the entrance to this continent and the sea routes around Cape Horn. Antarctica is known as a continent of and for peace. Under a treaty, it's supposed to be free of all the tensions and troubles that divide the world. Nuclear research and military activity are banned. Scientific work is all that is allowed. And yet the various nations who hold their wedge-shaped claims to this continent have long disputed each other's territory. Argentina is among them. One day there may be a rush for the minerals here.
Now some of today's other stories. A 17-year-old boy from Lincolnshire has been awarded damages of more than £250,000 at Lincoln Crown Court. He was left blind and crippled after a routine appendix operation went wrong. Lenny Darwood had the operation in a Grimsby hospital 3 years ago. Humberside Health Authority admitted liability. The boy's lawyer said an anaesthetic was used negligently and Lenny wasn't properly looked after when deprived of oxygen. Lenny's brain isn't damaged, but he needs constant care. About a quarter of the money will be paid immediately so his parents can buy and adapt a bungalow. At many hospitals, members of the health workers union COSI have started industrial action over their 12% pay claim. At some places, including Britain's largest blood transfusion centre in South London, there were 2-hour strikes. Elsewhere, pickets made sure only urgent cases were admitted. Ford's made a pre-tax profit of £220 million last year, only £6 million down on 1980. It makes them Britain's most profitable vehicle manufacturer by far, and the most successful part of the Ford empire. The football presenter Jimmy Hill has apologised in court for comments he made about the Football League nearly 4 years ago. Mr. Hill attacked the league at the time for offering exclusive coverage of matches to one ITV company. For their part, the league have dropped a libel action over the case, which was nicknamed the Snatch of the Day affair. Tonight's football results: League Division 1, Notts County 3, Stoke 1. Division 3, Brentford 2, Wimbledon 3. Division 4, Port Vale 1, Hereford 1, Crewe 0, Bradford City 1. The actress who perhaps more than anyone summed up the decent British housewife of the war years, Dame Celia Johnson, has died at the age of 73. She suffered a stroke at her home in Oxfordshire. She became a Dame Commander of the British Empire last year after a career which stretched back to 1928. In more recent years, Dame Celia had a number of West End successes and created several classical parts on television. She even slipped out of her usual well-groomed roles to play a lively nurse in the BBC television Shakespeare Romeo and Juliet. But she'll be best remembered for the series of Noel Coward films she starred in during the 40s, especially Brief Encounter with Trevor Howard.
All right, darling.
Yes, I'm all right.
I wish I could think of something to say.
It doesn't matter not saying anything, I mean.
I'll miss my train and wait and see you in
No, please don't. I'll come over with you to your platform, I'd rather.
Very well.
Do you think we shall ever see each other again?
I don't know. Not for years, anyway.
Children will all be grown up. I wonder if they'll ever meet and know each other.
Couldn't I write you just once in a while?
No, Alec, please, you know we promised.
Oh, dear. I do love you. So that is.
That woman's job to see that my grass is cut and my flowers are watered every day.
35 years later, Dame Celia and Trevor Howard were reunited for a TV play set at the end of the British Raj in India.
Nice broth first, bloody box later, but not today. Now, if we drink up all our nice broth and then have a good sleep this afternoon, who knows? We might have a nice arrowroot biscuit for tea, eh?
No arrowroot, ma'am sahab, only get it.
Oh.
Dame Celia, who died today. And finally, the main points of today's news on the Falklands. The commander of the Argentine troops on South Georgia formally surrendered to the British at 10 o'clock this morning. All 180 of them have been taken prisoner. In Washington, the Argentine foreign minister is trying to persuade other American countries to support Argentina. President Reagan has declared that time for a peaceful settlement is running out, and that was also the message tonight from Mrs. Thatcher. But she didn't rule out more military action either. The greater the military pressure, the greater the chance of a peaceful settlement, she said. That's all from me. Good night.
Admiral Woodward gets his birthday present.